I was never the problem. Maybe it's finally time to choose myself over everything that has been breaking me.
She was 47 years old when she finally said the sentence out loud. Not to a therapist, not to her husband, just to herself, standing in front of a bathroom mirror on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that gives no warning that it's about to become the day everything changes. She looked at her own reflection and said quietly, "I was never the problem." It had taken her 28 years to believe that sentence, and it had started with 4 words, spoken by someone she trusted, on a night she never stopped remembering. This is the story of Eleanor Rae Calloway. It's not a story about a crime. No one was arrested, no one disappeared, but something was taken from her all the same, in the way that words can take things, quietly, without a sound, without leaving a mark anyone else could see. And for nearly 3 decades, she carried it the way people carry things they've been told not to talk about. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly what those 4 words were, why they took root so deeply, and what it finally took to pull them out. You'll meet the man who said them, and you'll understand that he was not a monster, which is, in its own way, the harder truth to sit with. And you'll meet a 16-year-old girl, decades later, who would end up being the reason Eleanor finally put the words down. But first, you need to understand who Eleanor was before she ever heard them. Because the story of a wound is always, first, a story of who existed before it. Here is what we're really asking, over the next 2 hours. Not who did what to whom, something quieter, and in some ways harder to answer. What does it mean to give everything you have to another person and still be told it wasn't enough? Who gets to decide what a woman's worth is measured against? And when someone hands you a belief about yourself, when you're too young or too tired to question it, how long does it take before you're old enough, or brave enough, to hand it back? There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a marriage, or a family, or even a single evening, after something is said that no one acknowledges again. The dishes still get washed, the children still get put to bed, life goes on in every visible way, but somewhere underneath the ordinary rhythm of things, a decision has been made, and it will quietly steer the next several decades of a person's life without either party ever naming it out loud. If you've ever laid awake replaying something someone said to you years ago, a sentence that shouldn't have had the power it did, and yet somehow reorganized the way you saw yourself, you already know the terrain of this story. You know what it is to smile at a family gathering while some old, unspoken arithmetic runs quietly in the background of your mind. You know what it is to be told you're loved and to nod, and to not entirely believe it. Wherever you're watching this from tonight, whatever town, whatever kitchen table, whatever quiet hour of your day this has found you in, I want you to know that this story was built for you. If it resonates, stay with it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing, because there are more stories like this one waiting. Eleanor grew up in a small house at the edge of a town most people have never heard of, Millbrook Falls, tucked into a valley in western Pennsylvania where the mill still ran 3 shifts a day and where everyone's mother knew everyone else's business before it had finished happening. Her father, Harold, worked the second shift at that mill for 31 years, coming home smelling of machine oil and cigarette smoke, too tired most evenings to do much more than eat dinner, in near silence and fall asleep in his recliner by 8:30. Her mother, Ruth, kept the house so clean you could have performed surgery in the kitchen, and ran her household with the quiet, exacting discipline of a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that control over small things was the only kind of control she was ever going to get. Eleanor was the middle of 3 daughters. Her older sister, Deborah, was the beauty of the family, doted on and occasionally resented for it. Her younger sister, Carol, was the baby, coddled and excused from most household duties. Eleanor occupied the space in between, old enough to be useful, young enough to be overlooked, and the one everyone in the family described, almost as a shorthand, as the sensible one. It's a phrase that sounds like a compliment until you sit with it long enough to realize what it actually means. No one is asking what you want. Sensible girls don't need to be asked. Sensible girls simply understand what's required and do it. What people outside the family rarely knew about Eleanor was that she was good at things quietly, in a way that had nothing to do with being sensible. She could fix a stalled lawnmower engine by the time she was 12, having taught herself from a repair manual she found buried in her father's toolbox, because Harold was too tired most evenings to teach her himself, and because when she asked him to, he'd said, not unkindly, "That's not really girls' work, Ellie." She read the manual anyway, alone in the garage on Saturday afternoons, and by 13, she was the one neighbors called when their own mowers wouldn't start. She read constantly, novels, encyclopedias, anything she could get her hands on from the town's small library, and hid the books under her mattress, because her mother believed too much reading made a girl flighty, prone to wanting things beyond her station. She had a laugh that people remembered long after they'd forgotten everything else about the conversation. Big, unguarded, the kind of laugh that made strangers in restaurants turn around to see what was so funny. Her sister Deborah called it obnoxious once, at the dinner table, in front of the whole family, and something in the way everyone went quiet and let the comment sit there, unchallenged, made 15-year-old Eleanor understand that the laugh was a liability. She didn't stop laughing, but she got quieter about it, for almost a year, testing out smaller versions of herself to see which ones drew less attention. What you need to understand about Eleanor at 17 is that she was not fragile, and she was not someone who needed protecting from the world, whatever her mother might have believed. She was curious in a way that unsettled people who preferred girls to be predictable. She was capable, genuinely, unusually capable, with a mind that could take apart a problem the way she took apart small engines, methodically, without panic. She was funny in a way that surprised people who'd written her off as merely sensible. And underneath all of it, she was hungry. Hungry for a life considerably bigger than the one that had been quietly mapped out for her since birth. She wanted, more than anything, to study engineering. She'd told her high school guidance counselor this once, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, and watched Mrs. Pruitt's expression shift into something politely skeptical, the kind of look adults give children when they're deciding whether a dream is worth the effort of correcting. "There's a fine nursing program at the community college," Mrs. Pruitt had offered instead, as though Eleanor had asked for suggestions rather than stated a fact about herself. Eleanor didn't correct her. She simply nodded, the way sensible girls do, and went home and kept the dream to herself, tucked away in the same private space where she kept her library books and her unguarded laugh. For one summer, the summer she turned 18, it seemed entirely possible that she would actually leave, that she'd take the small scholarship she'd earned and go 2 hours east to the state university and become the kind of woman who built things rather than simply maintained them. That was the summer everything else happened instead. She met a boy named Wesley Calloway at the Millbrook Falls County Fair, at the edge of the horse pavilion, where he was helping his uncle sell raffle tickets for the volunteer fire department. It's the kind of meeting that, in hindsight, always seems to carry more weight than it actually did in the moment. Two young people standing near a table of raffle tickets, making small talk about nothing, neither of them aware they were standing at the beginning of 28 years. Wesley was charming in the specific way that small towns tend to produce, confident without being arrogant, well-liked by nearly everyone, the kind of young man mothers pointed to as proof that their daughters could do considerably worse. Eleanor was suspicious of easy charm. She'd watched her older sister Deborah get swept up, more than once, by boys who said all the right things at 17 and 18 and meant almost none of it by 20. But Wesley was patient in a way those boys hadn't been. He asked her what she was reading. He asked her, genuinely, what an engineer actually did all day, and then listened to her answer for longer than anyone outside her own head ever had. It was, for Eleanor, a kind of attention she hadn't experienced before, someone treating her curiosity as an asset rather than a quirk to be managed. They dated for 3 years. Wesley worked at the plant his father had worked at, saving toward a down payment on a house, steady and reliable in a way that Ruth, Eleanor's mother, approved of loudly and often. "A girl could do a lot worse than a boy who shows up," Ruth told her more than once, which Eleanor understood, even then, to be the family's version of a blessing. They married in June, when Eleanor was 20, in the same small Methodist church where she'd been baptized. Ruth cried at the ceremony, happy tears, she said, though Eleanor sometimes wondered, in later years, if some portion of them had been relief. A daughter married off is a daughter no longer your responsibility to explain. no longer a question mark hanging over the family's respectability. Harold gave a short, awkward toast at the reception about how proud he was, and Eleanor remembers feeling, in that exact moment, genuinely happy. Not resigned, not settling, but happy. The way a person can be happy standing at the very beginning of a life they don't yet know the shape of. For the first 2 years of the marriage, it was, by Eleanor's own later account, good. Not extraordinary, not the kind of love people write novels about, but steady, warm, full of the small competencies that come with building a life alongside another person. A first apartment above a hardware store, a used Ford they rebuilt the transmission on together over 3 consecutive weekends. The particular satisfaction two people feel when they've figured out, jointly, how to be a functioning unit in the world. Eleanor put her engineering ambitions on hold when she became pregnant with their first daughter, Marissa, at 22. She told herself, and Wesley told her too, that it was temporary. That once things settled, once the baby was older, she'd look into finishing her degree. She told herself a great many things were temporary in those years. Most of them weren't. The night it happened, the night that mattered, the one that would echo for 28 years, was not a special night. That's part of what makes it so difficult to explain. Even now, to people who ask why she never simply let it go. There was no anniversary, no dramatic betrayal, no single clean moment you could point to and say, there, that's where it went wrong. It was an ordinary Tuesday in October, and Eleanor was 23 years old, and their second daughter, Josephine, had been born 11 weeks earlier with a case of colic, so severe that neither Eleanor nor Wesley had slept a full night in over 2 months. Wesley had been passed over for a foreman's promotion at the plant that week, a role he'd wanted, had prepared for, had told co-workers with some confidence that he expected to get. The job went instead to a man with less seniority, but a closer relationship to the plant manager, and Wesley took the news the way a certain kind of proud, tired young man takes disappointment, privately and badly. He didn't come straight home that evening. He stopped at a bar on Route 9 with 2 friends from the plant, drank 3 beers he couldn't really afford, and let them tell him, one round at a time, that he'd been wronged. He came home a little after 11 and found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table under a single overhead light, exhausted in the specific, bone-deep way that new mothers are exhausted, the baby finally asleep after nearly 2 hours of crying that Eleanor had walked and rocked and hummed her way through alone. In front of Eleanor was a stack of bills she'd been trying, without much success, to make sense of for the better part of an hour. The electric bill higher than expected, a copay from Josephine's pediatrician visit, the used car's transmission acting up again. She looked up when he came in and said something small, practical, the kind of comment any exhausted young wife might make about money being tighter than it should be. She would spend years afterward trying to remember the exact words and never quite managing it. Something about needing to talk through the budget, something about hoping his check would stretch further this month than last. It was not an accusation. It was not even really a complaint. It was simply a tired woman naming a tired fact. But Wesley was carrying a resentment that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with his own disappointment. And disappointment, when a person doesn't know what to do with it, has a way of looking for the nearest available target. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still in his work boots, and said the 4 words that would outlive the marriage itself, outlive the decade that followed, outlive even his own memory of having said them at all. You're never enough, Eleanor. He didn't elaborate. He didn't specify what, exactly, she wasn't enough for. Money, support, patience, love, some combination of all 4. He said it the way a person says something they don't intend to be permanent, the way you might slam a door without registering how loud the sound actually is, inside a quiet house. Then he walked past her, went upstairs, and went to bed. In the morning, hungover and a little ashamed of himself in the vague, unspecific way men like Wesley often are the morning after a bad night, he didn't remember saying it at all. Eleanor never told him she remembered either. What happened inside Eleanor in the minutes that followed was not dramatic. She didn't cry. She didn't follow him upstairs to confront him. She sat at the kitchen table for another 20 minutes, finished sorting through the bills as best she could, turned off the overhead light, and went to sleep beside a man who was already snoring, entirely unaware of what he'd just set into motion. But something had shifted. in the quiet, invisible way that a single sentence can shift the architecture of how a person understands herself. Here is the particular cruelty of what happened that night, though it would take Eleanor decades to name it clearly. She had spent her entire childhood being told, in a dozen small ways, that she was too much, too loud with her laugh, too curious for a girl, too much of a handful for a household that prized quiet, sensible daughters. And now, at 23, in her own kitchen, she was being told the precise opposite. Not enough. Not enough for her husband. Not enough as a wife. Not enough as whatever measure he was using in that unguarded, resentful moment. Both things could not be true. A person cannot simultaneously be too much and not enough of the same substance. And yet, from that night forward, Eleanor began to believe both at once, that she existed in some impossible, shrinking space between excess and deficiency, and that the only way to be safe in that space was to take up as little room as possible while producing as much as she could. She did not decide this consciously. No one decides a thing like that. It simply became, over the following weeks and months, the quiet operating logic underneath everything she did. She never mentioned it to Wesley. Not that week, not that year, not ever. She told herself, more than once, that it hadn't really mattered, that it was a tired man's careless sentence on a hard night, and that dwelling on it would only make something small into something large. She was, after all, the sensible one. She knew how to let things go. She did not know, that October night, that she had just absorbed a wound that would quietly restructure the next 28 years of her life, that would follow her into every room she entered, every compliment she deflected, every ounce of help she refused to ask for. She thought she had simply had an unpleasant evening. She had no way of knowing, yet, what those 4 words were about to cost her. Here is what nobody tells you about a wound like the one Eleanor absorbed that night. It doesn't announce itself again. Wesley never repeated those exact words. In fact, by most external measures, he was a decent husband for the 2 decades that followed. Present at dinner most nights, faithful as far as Eleanor ever knew, a good enough father to their 2 daughters. The kind of man who coached Little League on Saturdays and never once raised a hand to anyone in his family. If you had asked their neighbors on Sycamore Street to describe the Calloway marriage, most would have called it solid, unremarkable, fine. A few might even have called it enviable. But Eleanor had absorbed something on that October night that reorganized the way she moved through every relationship that came after, including, and perhaps especially, her relationship with herself. She began, without ever consciously deciding to, keeping score of her own value in the currency of usefulness. If she could not be enough by nature, if that had already been decided, on a Tuesday, in a kitchen, by the person who knew her best, then perhaps she could try to be enough by output. Perhaps if she did enough, gave enough, produced enough evidence of her own worth, the verdict could be quietly overturned, even if the appeal was never filed with the person who'd issued it. She took on more than her share of the household labor, not because Wesley ever demanded it, but because some part of her had concluded that a woman who asked for help was proving the very insufficiency she was desperately trying to disprove. She stopped asking him to get up with the girls at night, even on nights she was so tired she could barely stand, reasoning privately that a wife who needed help was not a wife who was enough. She managed every doctor's appointment, every school conference, every holiday meal for both sides of the family, every small crisis that arose in a house with 2 young children, and she did it with a kind of relentless competence that people around her genuinely admired, never guessing at the engine that was quietly running underneath it. She stopped mentioning her engineering ambitions altogether, not because Wesley ever discouraged them a second time. He didn't, and to his credit, if she'd raised the idea of finishing her degree at any point in those years, it's likely he would have supported it. But wanting something for herself now felt, to Eleanor, like a kind of evidence. Proof of exactly the insufficiency she'd been accused of, proof that she was still, underneath the competent surface, the same girl who'd once been called too much. It was safer, she came to believe without ever quite articulating it, to want nothing that could be used against her. Marissa and Josephine grew up watching a mother who gave endlessly and asked for almost nothing in return, and they absorbed a lesson from it that Eleanor never intended to teach, and would have been horrified to learn she'd taught. They learned that love was something a woman earns through exhaustion. They learned that a mother's worth is measured in what she produces. Meals made, forms signed, costumes sewn for school plays at midnight, rather than in who she simply is, apart from any of that output. There were moments across those years when the old wounds surfaced in ways Eleanor couldn't fully name, even to herself. When Josephine, at 11, brought home a school science project she'd worked hard on for 2 weeks, glowing with pride as she set it on the kitchen counter, Eleanor found herself offering only a clipped, measured compliment, some private worry rising in her that too much praise would make the girl soft, unprepared for a world that wouldn't always be kind to her, a worry that had nothing whatsoever to do with Josephine's actual project, and everything to do with the lesson Eleanor herself had absorbed about the danger of being too much. Josephine's face fell, just slightly, in a way Eleanor noticed and then, characteristically, told herself she'd imagined. There was a moment, on their 15th wedding anniversary, that Eleanor would return to many times in her memory, turning it over the way you might turn over a stone looking for what's underneath it. Wesley had planned a small dinner at the one nice restaurant in the next town over, had even, uncharacteristically, bought her flowers beforehand. Over dessert, in a rare moment of open tenderness, he took her hand across the table and told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Eleanor smiled. She thanked him. She meant the thank you, in the sense that she was grateful he'd said it. But she did not believe a single word of the sentence itself. Not really, not in the part of her that had been keeping score since she was 23. Some part of her had already filed the compliment away, as temporary, provisional, subject to revision, the next time she failed to be enough of whatever he might need. She went home that night and lay awake beside him, turning over the strange fact that a person could receive real tenderness and still, somewhere underneath it, remain entirely unconvinced. It would be inaccurate and unfair to the actual texture of Eleanor's life to describe those 28 years as simply unhappy. There were genuinely good years. A vacation to the Delaware coast when the girls were small, which Eleanor would describe for the rest of her life as the happiest week she could remember. Sunburned shoulders, saltwater taffy, Wesley teaching Marissa to body surf while Eleanor watched from a beach towel and felt, briefly, entirely at peace. A Christmas when both daughters were home from college and the house was loud with laughter in a way that reminded her, unexpectedly, of who she'd been before any of this. The girl with the big, unguarded laugh that made strangers turn around. In moments like those, she'd think, maybe I've let it go. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. Maybe I've outgrown it. And then some small, unremarkable thing, a comment about the household budget, an especially exhausted evening, a moment of feeling unseen in a room full of people who loved her, would reach down into that same old place inside her, and she'd feel the floor of herself give way just slightly, the way old floorboards give under familiar weight. And she'd understand, in that instant, that she hadn't let it go at all. She'd only learned, over the years, to carry it quietly enough that no one, including herself, had to look at it directly for very long. Her sister Deborah asked her once, at their mother's funeral of all places, both of them standing near the casket in the same church where Eleanor had been married decades earlier, whether Eleanor was happy. It was an odd, unguarded question for the setting, and Eleanor answered the way she answered most difficult questions by then, quickly and with a kind of practiced certainty. "Of course I am," she said. "Wesley's a good man. I have everything I need." Deborah looked at her for a long moment, the way sisters sometimes look at each other when they suspect there's a whole conversation happening underneath the one that's audible, and then let it go, because that's what people in families like Eleanor's had always done. They let things go. They were sensible about it. The moment that finally cracked the silence Eleanor had maintained for nearly 3 decades didn't come from Wesley. By then, it couldn't have. Wesley had passed away 3 years earlier, quietly, in his sleep, of a heart condition no one had known was serious until it was. It came instead from her granddaughter, on an evening in early spring when Eleanor was 68 years old. Her daughter Josephine called in tears, the kind of tears that come out sideways, in fragments, before the person crying has fully organized what they're upset about. Josephine's husband, Daniel, a good man by every account Eleanor had ever gathered, had said something to their 16-year-old daughter, Ava, after a disappointing report card arrived in the mail. Nothing shouted, nothing dramatic, just a tired, careless comment delivered at the end of a long day about how Ava needed to actually try for once, instead of always falling short. Josephine had overheard it from the hallway, and something in her had recognized the shape of that sentence immediately, viscerally, though she couldn't have said why at the time. She called her mother that evening because she didn't fully understand what she was feeling, and some instinct told her Eleanor might. Eleanor listened to her daughter cry on the phone, and somewhere in the listening, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 28 years. Recognition. Sharp and complete, and entirely unwelcome. Josephine described what had happened after Daniel's comment. How Ava had gone quiet, said nothing, walked calmly up to her room without a single word of protest. How she'd come back downstairs an hour later, oddly cheerful, offering to help with dinner, apologizing unprompted for the report card, working twice as hard for the rest of the evening to be pleasant, to be useful, to be, in whatever currency was available to a 16-year-old, enough. Eleanor sat with the phone against her ear and recognized, in her granddaughter's silence and subsequent overcorrection, the exact architecture she had built inside herself on an October night 45 years earlier. The same quiet recalibration. The same decision, made without a single word spoken about it, to become smaller and more useful rather than risk hearing a sentence like that again. She had spent nearly 3 decades believing that what happened to her in that kitchen had been particular to her marriage, her personality, her own private failure to simply let a careless comment go. Hearing Josephine describe Ava's reaction, she understood, for the first time, that it was not particular to her at all. It was a pattern that had, apparently, without her ever intending it, made its way down through a family she loved. Eleanor did not sleep much that night. In the morning, she drove the 40 minutes to her daughter's house without calling ahead, which was unlike her. Eleanor had spent her entire adult life being the person who called ahead, who never imposed, who made herself easy to accommodate. She found Ava in her room, cheerful in the same performed way Josephine had described, doing homework at her desk, with a diligence that, Eleanor now understood, was less about the homework itself than about proving something to a parent who'd already moved on to worrying about something else entirely. Eleanor sat down on the edge of her granddaughter's bed. For a long moment she didn't say anything at all, unsure even then whether she had the right words, or the right to offer them. And then, for the first time in her entire life, she told someone else the 4 words that had quietly organized nearly 3 decades of her own existence. She told Ava about the kitchen table, and the bills, and the baby who wouldn't stop crying, and the promotion Wesley hadn't gotten, and the 3 beers at a bar on Route 9. She told her about the exact sentence, spoken by a tired man on an ordinary Tuesday, that he never remembered saying, and that she had never once managed to forget. She told her about the 28 years that followed, not as a confession, not as a burden she was setting down on a 16-year-old's shoulders, but simply as one person telling another the truth about what she had carried and what it had cost. And then she said the thing she had never once said to herself in the moment it happened, the thing she had needed, desperately, for someone, anyone, to say to her on that October night, and that no one ever had, because no one had known. What your father said last week, Eleanor told her granddaughter, wasn't about you, it was about his own bad day, wearing your name. And what your grandfather said to me all those years ago wasn't about me either. It was about his disappointment, looking for somewhere to land. We just happened to be standing there. Ava cried then, not the performed cheerfulness she'd been offering all evening, but something real, something that had clearly been sitting in her chest for longer than a single report card would account for. And Eleanor held her granddaughter and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that this was the reason the wound had lasted 28 years without ever fully healing. It had been waiting, all that time, not for an apology from Wesley, he was gone and could never give one now, but for exactly this, the chance to finally say the truth out loud, to someone young enough to still have a choice about whether to carry it forward. Eleanor never got to confront Wesley about that night in October. He had been gone 3 years by the time she fully understood the shape of what those 4 words had done to her, and there was no longer anyone left to hold accountable for having said them. This is, in its own way, part of the story too. A part that doesn't resolve the way a courtroom drama resolves, with a verdict and a sentence and a sense of justice delivered. Sometimes the reckoning a person needs doesn't arrive as confrontation at all. Sometimes it arrives as understanding, offered first to someone else, that finally loops back around and reaches the person who needed it most urgently in the first place. What Eleanor came to understand, in the weeks and months following that evening in Ava's bedroom, was not that Wesley had been a villain in her story. He had been, by every honest measure she could apply, a tired, disappointed 25-year-old man who said something cruel on a genuinely hard night, and who never thought about it again afterward because, for him, the sentence hadn't mattered. It had cost him nothing to say. That asymmetry, the way a single sentence can be nothing at all to the person who says it, and everything, for decades, to the person who receives it, became for Eleanor the actual subject of everything she had lived through. She had spent 28 years organizing her entire sense of self around 4 words that the man who spoke them didn't even remember having said. She did not spend her remaining years being angry at Wesley for it, though she allowed herself, for the first time, to be honestly sad about it. Sad for the young woman at the kitchen table who had no way of knowing what she was about to absorb. Sad for the decades of quiet self-diminishment that followed. She found, to her own surprise, that she could hold both truths at once. That Wesley had been, overall, a good husband and father, and that he had also, on one ordinary Tuesday, said something that reorganized her entire life, without ever knowing he'd done it. Grief, and gratitude, and grief again, layered on top of each other, the way most honest reckonings with a long marriage tend to be. She began, slowly, over the months that followed, to ask herself a different question than the one she had been quietly asking for 28 years. Not how can I finally be enough, a question with no real answer, since the standard itself had never been hers to begin with. Instead, enough for what exactly, and according to whom? And when she sat with that question honestly, turning it over the way she used to turn over a stalled engine at 12 years old, looking for the actual source of the problem rather than the symptom, she realized there had never been a real, considered answer behind Wesley's 4 words at all. There had only been an old, borrowed measuring stick, handed to her on a night when she was too exhausted and too young to know she didn't have to accept it. At 70, Eleanor enrolled in 2 engineering courses at the same community college Mrs. Pruitt had once suggested as a consolation prize 52 years earlier. She did not do this to prove anything to anyone, and certainly not to Wesley, who would never know about it. She did it because, for the first time in her adult life, wanting something for herself no longer felt like evidence against her. She was, by her own description, terrible at the coursework at first, laughably out of practice, the youngest person in her study group by roughly 4 decades. She stayed anyway. She finished both courses. She told almost no one, and the people she did tell, Josephine, and eventually Ava, understood, without her having to explain it fully, exactly what it meant. Ava, for her part, did not carry the 4 words her father had spoken to her the way Eleanor had carried Wesley's. Whether that was because of the conversation on the edge of her bed, or because 16-year-olds today have language for these things that Eleanor's generation never had, or simply because the pattern had finally been named out loud somewhere along its path, it's impossible to say with certainty. What is certain is that Ava, a year later, told her own mother calmly and without apparent bitterness that the comment about the report card had hurt her and that she needed her father to know that. Daniel apologized. It was, by Josephine's account, a short, unremarkable conversation. It was also, in the context of everything that came before it in this family, an entirely new kind of conversation. The kind where a wound gets named while it's still fresh enough to heal cleanly, rather than left to calcify quietly for 28 years. If you've made it this far, I suspect there's a reason. Maybe you're carrying a version of Eleanor's 4 words, your own particular sentence, said to you on your own ordinary night, by someone who has long since forgotten saying it, while you have never once forgotten hearing it. Maybe you've spent years, or decades, measuring your worth against a standard nobody ever actually asked you to meet, handed to you on a night when you were too tired, or too young, or too much in love to question whether it was true. Maybe like Eleanor, you've built an entire architecture of usefulness around a wound you've never said out loud to another living person. Maybe you've watched, with a discomfort you couldn't quite name, as your own children or grandchildren began to absorb the same quiet lesson, that love is something to be earned through exhaustion, rather than something you were always entitled to simply by existing. Here is what I want to leave you with. The scars that shape us most deeply are almost never the ones anyone else can see. They live in the quiet recalibrations we make after a single sentence, in how much smaller we allow ourselves to become, in how hard we work to earn a love we were never actually required to earn. But a scar, unlike an open wound, is proof that something healed. Not that it didn't happen, not that it didn't hurt, or that it doesn't still ache sometimes on the anniversary of a particular Tuesday in October. Just that you survived it. And that survival, however quiet, however invisible to everyone around you, made you capable of eventually asking the questions Eleanor finally asked. Questions that took her 28 years to reach, and that you, watching this tonight, might reach considerably sooner, simply because someone finally said the whole thing out loud in a story, instead of leaving it buried in a kitchen on an ordinary night. So I'll ask you what I asked you at the very beginning of this story. What words have you been carrying that were never actually true? Whose voice have you let define your worth, and when, if ever, did you last stop to ask whether that voice had earned the authority you gave it? I would love to know where you're watching this from tonight. What town, what kitchen table, what quiet hour has found you here? Tell me in the comments, and tell me, if you're willing, what this story stirred up for you. There's no wrong answer. Sometimes the most honest comment is simply, "This reminded me of someone I haven't thought about in years." And if stories like Eleanor's speak to something in you, the quiet ones, the ones that don't make headlines but shape entire lives all the same, consider subscribing, because there are more women's stories waiting to be told here, told the way they actually happened, without the noise. Thank you for spending these 2 hours with Eleanor's story. Wherever you are tonight, I hope something in it loosened, even slightly, some old, borrowed weight you've been carrying longer than you should have had to. I'll see you in the next one.